Welcome to McGrath and Macmillan's Discovery-Driven Growth. Chapter 4, Designing Specific Growth Initiatives. The following presentation was created by Group 4 team members Andrea Janis, Brian Reddick, Aaron Feathers, Madan Kumar Satyamurthy, and Stephen Craig Whitley. Chapter 4 represents the final chapter under the corporate leadership heading of the Discovery-Driven Growth Model. At this point in the Discovery-Driven Growth process, you will have spelled out a clear strategy for your firm or business groups, conducted an assessment of the firm's portfolio, and made decisions regarding the investment of resources in growth initiatives that are deemed necessary to achieve your corporate growth ambitions. This chapter teaches us how to connect those higher-level strategic decisions to specific actionable tasks in each of your strategic initiatives. It is important to point out that for core enhancement, infrastructure projects, and capital investment projects, McGrath and Macmillan recommend that you're probably better off using conventional corporate planning processes. As noted in the previous slide, the firm has already decided which projects that the company will pursue to achieve its new growth strategy and goals. Examples that you may recall from the textbook include DuPont's KIU system, Ingredients Inc.'s growing revenues to become one of the top 5 companies in its industry, and ESCO's strategy to simply outperform its competition. After the company has its corporate plan in place, the next step in the discovery-driven growth process is to map out plans for each of the firm's growth initiatives and goals. A couple of key recommendations by McGrath and Macmillan were to 1. Appoint a business or project manager to lead the discovery-driven process for each major growth initiative, and 2. Assign a neutral business or project manager for each growth initiative. It's very important to make sure that the plan manager for each initiative is not an executive team member who has been championing the growth initiative all along. Before teams are developed for each growth project, a management structure and growth team should be established. There is not a right or a wrong way to establish these teams, although there is a roadmap that's been laid out by firms and projects that have been successful in the past. And what experts have found out is that when you look at all these successful projects, they have basically 4 features in common. The first is that they are composed of 1 or more dedicated team members. These individuals' primary, not their part-time, job at the firm is growth. Second, there is a connection to leadership. These team members have access to leadership and their expertise and their influence. Third, there's a mixture of knowledge and skills. These teams have a range of knowledge and skills as well as expertise in the technology or operations of the prospective project. And lastly, they have expertise in innovation, venturing, or new business development. At least 1 or more team members should have this knowledge. It is important that growth teams have independence from the normal firm structure and reporting schedule. This structure has been referred to as an ambidextrous organizational form. And this independence should also be exercised in resource allocation, meaning budget and human resources. As you can appreciate, it's very easy to take resources from a non-core initiative when resources become scarce in an organization, and we see this all the time, but in order to grow, these resources need to remain in place. 2 examples of independence that you may recall when reading Chapter 4 were IBM and Fortis. IBM, for example, discovered that one of the main reasons their growth initiatives were failing was due to resources being taken away from such projects when other core businesses needed them. And after they enacted the Godfather program, as they called it, that stopped this practice from occurring, they began to enjoy growth in their Emerging Business Opportunities program. Fortis, on the other hand, has a 3-level governance structure that allows their growth teams to have independence, yet still closely ties them to the corporation. Once the team and governance structure has been established and are in place, the firm can turn its attention to actually planning its project. The 5 steps involved in creating a frame for a growth project include: 1. Identify the project's contribution to profits, taking into consideration the competitive pace of the industry. The time frame for this growth contribution should be the amount of time the project will need to get from startup to generating steady profits or steady profit growth. 2. Determine required revenues. How much revenue will the project need to get to the level of profit specified in Step 1? Obviously, these figures will include assumptions, and it should be pointed out that some firms actually prefer to reverse the steps and do Step 2 first and Step 1 second, because they are more comfortable of estimating revenues first and then develop an idea around profits after generating a revenue forecast. Either way is okay. 3. Specify profitability. How much profit should the project make during the time period? Both return on investment, or ROI, and return on assets, ROA, are acceptable means for coming up with this figure. 4th, create a project scope, and this will lay out the above numbers in one coherent document. And lastly, calculate a bare bones NPV, or net present value, for the project. NPV estimates give an indication of whether it is worth continuing with the plan or not. As you likely noticed in the previous slide, we've introduced a new term called bare bones NPV. In 2008, one of our textbook authors, Rita McGrath, attributed the term and methodology of calculating bare bones NPV to her co-author of Discovery-Driven Growth, Ian McMillan, and a colleague of his named Alan Abrahams. It should be noted that bare bones NPV is a pared down version of the net present value calculation method as we know it. To calculate a bare bones NPV, one has to estimate and input 9 variables into a bare bones NPV Excel model. And that's the beauty of the bare bones NPV calculation process. It is not as time consuming as the laborious process of calculating year by year revenues and expenses over the entire life of a project. However, McGrath and Macmillan both contend that this slimmer, pared down version of the NPV model is sufficient to achieve what they call roughly right results for the purpose of discovery-driven planning. The 9 variables that we must account for and estimate when calculating an NPV are: first, the launch time. How long until it will take to generate our first revenues? Second, the ramp-up time. How long will it take for our project to move from its first revenues to a steady flow of profits? The bare bones method assumes that this is going to be a linear ramp-up. 3. What's the competitive response time? Meaning, how long after the launch will it take before competitors begin to respond to our product or our offer? 4. The competitive erosion time. How long will it take before our competitors' response will begin diminishing profits to the point of covering fixed costs? As with the ramp-up period, the bare bones NPV calculation method assumes profits will drop off in a linear fashion from the start of the competitive response period to the end of the erosion time. 5th, what is our total investment? Meaning, what is the one-time investment that we're going to incur at the end of the launch time? 6, the discount rate. Of course, this is the number or the rate used to discount future cash flows. The cost of capital according to accounting and finance. Hopefully, the project offers a better return than money held in savings during this same time frame. And the last 3 variables are the expected fixed costs at a steady state, the expected annual variable cost per unit at steady state, and lastly, the expected annual revenues in units at steady state. To get a better understanding of the bare bones NPV concept, we have created a graphic that demonstrates the project demand life cycle of bare bones NPV. It basically assumes that you're going to make some initial investments in a project, that you take some time before you begin to generate revenues, that you reach a steady state of revenue, and eventually you sell off the inventory and terminate the project once it is no longer profitable. The first phase is called the launch phase, which we have listed here as phase 1, and we've highlighted in a light blue box. And this is the phase where the initial project investment is made, but there is no generation of revenues. In phase 2, which we've highlighted in light green, and it's called the ramp-up phase, this is where you start to make some money. This is when the first product unit is sold, and it ends when revenues stabilize. During this phase, you accumulate inventory and receivables for use in subsequent phases. During phase 3, which we've highlighted in dark orange and called it the steady state phase, this is where demand and revenues are predicted to remain in a steady state. And lastly, in phase 4, color-coded or highlighted in lavender, in what we call the erosion phase that we mentioned earlier, it is a period when competitors are eroding their profits to the point that you are no longer making them and you have to shut down your operations. So when you kind of back away from it and look at this graphic, it's a little bit easier to understand the overall concept of bare bones NPV. As mentioned in the 2 previous slides, performing a bare bones NPV requires creation of a bare bones NPV spreadsheet model. The bare bones NPV model referred to in our textbook is a Microsoft Excel model used to evaluate investments in uncertain projects. We should point out that a free download of the model is available on the Discovery Driven Growth textbook's website at the URL address www.discoverydrivengrowth.com/resources, or at Rita McGrath's website located at the URL address www.ritamcgrath.com/tools/spreadsheets. These sample models incorporate all 9 bare bones variables. McGrath and Macmillan tout the model as being highly reliable unless the investment, ramp-up, and erosion profiles are very bizarre. By now you may be wondering exactly what the bare bones NPV model looks like. We've taken some time to clip a couple of snapshots of McGrath's bare bones NPV model, downloaded from her website. We've broken it into 2 slides. Slide 10 here shows the upper half of the model, and the following slide will show the lower half. The upper half of the model requires input of key data and information related to the launch phase and the ramp-up phases. And you'll see that those input areas are over on the left side of the model. Key variables required in this portion of the model are duration in years, expenditures during the launch phase, investment amounts, days of accumulating inventory, and days of accumulating receivables. The graph that's located in the upper center of the model simply illustrates cost per year versus revenues per year in the years that followed the project launch phase, while the far right column, highlighted there in yellow, depicts the final calculated bare bones NPV or net present value for the project. The lower half of the bare bones NPV model requires manual input for the steady state and erosion phases. Data and information to be provided includes duration for both phases in years, the demand rate in units per year for the steady state phase, and lastly, the discount rate, cost and expenditures, and price per unit are recorded for all 4 phases. Once all data for the 4 phases have been entered into the model, the final net present value is calculated, as illustrated in the example shown here on slide 11, and in the previous slide, the final net present value, or NPV, is illustrated in the far right column of the model highlighted in yellow, and in the lower left corner of the model under the label bare bones NPV, which in this particular example is a bare bones NPV of $281.06 thousand. The graph in the center of the lower half of the model simply displays the differential between the cost and revenue lines that were illustrated in the graph shown in the upper half of the model on slide 10. To walk students through the discovery-driven planning process, the Discovery-Driven Growth textbook provides an example called the BioBarrier Project, which is actually a disguised version of a corporate growth project of a major American corporation. The description of the BioBarrier Project is broken into 3 sections, which provides us information about the corporation's mandate, its invention, and its definition and view of what success is expected to look like. In its discussion of the firm's corporate mandate, we learned that a chemical company called MC Chem decided at the corporate level to go beyond their chemicals roots and move into bioscience products. The executives were looking specifically for highly differentiated, highly margined products. The senior team created a growth platform in which MC Chem would develop markets with at least 2 times the core business margin potential, and that margin growth was more important than volume growth. Additionally, they wanted products for which technical issues had already been resolved. In its description of the firm's invention, we learned that MC Chem has invented a new type of disinfecting fluid. It appears to be about 50% more effective than competitive products used to eliminate bacteria and viruses. It is a product that the firm believes will achieve its corporate mandate. The product has proven to be highly effective, and it's already passed the FDA approval process. In defining success, we see that a discovery-driven plan was developed to determine what needed to be accomplished to make the venture successful. Many market factors were considered. Comparisons were made to other markets and industries. McKim's leaders decided that they wanted the product to do as well or better than new product introductions in the pharmaceuticals industry. And based on that, decisions were made regarding necessary numbers, and they ultimately decided on a minimum ROA of 33% and a minimum operating margin of 20%. In its initial frame, with this information in hand, the firm could go about performing a few simple calculations to specify what would represent success for the BioBarrier project, creating in effect the initial frame for the BioBarrier project, which is illustrated on our next slide. The initial frame for the BioBarrier project is illustrated in Table 4.1 of McGrath and Macmillan's Discovery-Driven Growth textbook, and is illustrated here on slide 13. Creating an initial frame like this is different in the discovery-driven planning process versus conventional planning. The discovery-driven planning process simply takes what must occur for the plan to be considered successful and then works backwards. We know, for example, that the company leaders wanted a minimum ROA of 33% and a minimum operating margin of 20%. 3 of the input variables in the initial frame have been provided by management. The remaining portion of the table can be calculated from just these 3 variables, using the calculation methodology that is described in the table. So what conclusions can one draw from reading this table? Namely, they are as follows. McKim shouldn't even consider investing in this project unless it promises, at a steady state of about 5 years, to generate at least $50 million in revenues with a maximum of $40 million in cost and no more than $40 million in total assets. The table displayed on slide 14 can be found as Figure 1 in your textbook, the Discovery-Driven Growth textbook that is, on page 87. It contains the specifications that MC Chem used to run the bare bones NPV model for the BioBarrier project. Key assumptions that MC Chem made in developing these specifications were as follows. They used the specification derived from Table 4.1, which we covered on slide 13. They assumed an initial investment of $30 million, fixed costs of 10% of total costs, meaning that the remaining 90% of costs were variable costs, 2 years to launch, 2 years to ramp up, a lifespan after launch of 15 years, which is made up of 7 years for the time to competitive entry after launch, and 8 years for the time from competitive entry to competitive erosion. Lastly, they assumed a discount rate of 15%. And with these assumptions, the bare bones NPV for the project was calculated to be a positive $7.69 million. The book's conclusion: the project is worth considerable further work. One of the great benefits of starting off planning a specific initiative with a clear frame is that sometimes, before you invest any money or time at all, it becomes obvious that an idea is just not going to work, or that you need a lot more information before you can confidently proceed. Some people don't see the value or benefit of a negative NPV calculation, but it is telling us what we need to hear. It's telling us to drop the project and put our firm's resources to better use, serving higher potential projects. We saw a classic example of this in the textbook, and when it talked about a young entrepreneur who had the idea that he wanted to start selling sliding door openers as a retrofit on existing homes. But during the framing part of the plan, it became obvious that he was going to be facing several obstacles. For example, the product would be of no interest to major distribution channels like Lowe's or Home Depot. Volumes would be too small. Similar products already existed that sold in the hundreds to thousands of dollars for people who were disabled and required modifications to the door frame, and even sometimes to the supporting structures of the home. The entrepreneur wisely considered what he learned during framing the project and decided to move on to a more favorable project. Each project that is part of your major growth thrust should be framed like the way the biobarrier case was framed, so that everyone is completely clear on what success will look like at project maturity and what financial assumptions that you made and used in the discovery-driven planning process. It's important to remember that these are just assumptions because, more than likely, you will have to revise them along the way. Framing a project and determining its bare bones NPV is not necessarily the end game per se. The next step in the process involves giving serious thought to the unit of business and key metrics that will comprise the business architecture for each strategic project. Chapter 4 has taught us a discovery-driven planning process for evaluating growth initiatives in a streamlined, time-efficient manner using a roughly accurate tool called bare bones NPV. This process is not used for core enhancement, infrastructure, or capital investment projects where traditional corporate planning methods are more appropriate. The discovery-driven planning process can be broken down into 5 easy steps or action plans. They include: 1. Determining the location and governance structure the firm has selected for each growth initiative. Next, senior management should identify and charge specific managers to execute each project plan, avoiding adding an executive that has been championing the project all along. The third step involves obtaining specifications for success that corporate leaders have developed for each project or growth initiative. The fourth step is often referred to as framing the project. The discovery-driven planning team should have a clear understanding of required profits, ROI or ROA, and allowable costs when completing this task. And lastly, the discovery-driven planning team needs to complete a bare bones NPV calculation to determine if this project should be dropped, move forward, or require more information before a final go or no-go decision can be made. This completes our final presentation for Chapter 4. Please stand by for the credits to roll.